Hi everyone. I'm Tim Bryant. I'm a professor in the English department at Buffalo State University, about an hour away from here. It was a nice drive today. I'm going to talk about the art of Ludic adaptation and the promise that you will learn how to make games out of books, movies, or almost anything. And almost anything refers to that moment about 20 years ago when I wanted to make a game based on watching television commercials. And then streaming took over. But fortunately, Amazon is bringing commercials back, so I might have a future. So this is just what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about my central terms, and then I'd like to talk about some of the common choices you make in adaptation. Those choices, the three choices I'm going to talk about, are really the tools that I think are transportable to almost any context. They're also the ones that I developed when I was teaching my classes on Introduction to Film Adaptation, which I did a few times. And then features of the games, probably not too much new, but you'll see what things I focus on as I've been doing this work. The majority of my talk will be these three examples, which are games that I've used in my classes. So in contrast to a lot of the work that you all are doing, my focus today in this talk is how I bring games and game-like dynamics and principles of play into the class during the very limited time frame. Most of my classes are either 3 times a week for 50 minutes apiece or twice a week for 75 minutes apiece. And what I've done and sort of the limits I impose in those sessions is based on an awareness of those constraints and what we can and cannot do. Mostly what we can do, because I really like to take my students by surprise and show them that we can do a lot more interactivity in the room, so that the content I'm teaching, including at times interactive fiction, can be in some, at least spirit, and sometimes in form, replicated in what they can do in our time that we have together face to face. I like the Oxford English Dictionary, and these are a couple of the terms that I get from the dictionary. So an adaptation, of course, is an altered or amended version of a text, musical, composition, etc., but especially one adapted for filming, broadcasting, or production on the stage from a novel or similar literary source. And I would say probably up until the 1960s or 70s, the standard emphasis in adaptation studies from an academic sense was either adapting Shakespeare to screen or adapting a novel, especially period pieces, to the screen. So novel to film adaptation really dominated the mid-20th century, at least academic perspective. And I think that's largely due to the fact that film studies was being taught by literature professors, English professors. And that changed a lot starting in the 70s and 80s when cinema, film, including production faculty, started being hired and took off as its own field and subfield. Adaptation as a term in this sense of definition 4 dates back to around 1699 or 1700. And the word adapt, at least in the OED, popped up in general around 1600. Ludic, of course, has to do with being playful behavior, and the OED has the first reference going back to 1940, which I find interesting given the history of play studies originating around the same time frame with Huizinga and other anthropologists. Ludic adaptation probably is something other people are thinking about it. For me, my personal history, I taught a class that I themed as Ludic adaptation in 2017. It came about because I taught the English major capstone class a few years prior as ergodic literature. And despite the brilliance of my students, I could see by the end of the semester on teaching literature that was intentionally difficult or labyrinthine or puzzle-like took its toll. So the second time I taught it as Ludic literature. And by that time I realized there's a lot of things I wanted to do that weren't constrained by a genre or a form. And I started teaching it more openly as a content-rich course that went across literature, film, games, hypertext, streaming media eventually. So ludic adaptation is the idea that you can take one thing and make it into something else, and in that process of adaptation you make it more playful or more like a game, or indeed actually like a game in the standard sense of the term, which is a troubling word to define. So when I teach adaptation, the three terms I focus on for my students in the film class are elision, interpolation, and invention. And they're kind of abstract Latinate words that give you a lot of ground to work in. But specifically, elision is the idea that you remove or omit things when you're going from one piece to another. And that's probably the most important step in order to give yourself a range of choices and freedom, that you are not beholden to the source text. Again, this is a critical step, in at least the academic side of things, that was painful. But as the quote says about fidelity, the idea that you have to be faithful, Dudley Andrew, another film critic, said that was a dead horse by the 1980s. So that was a discussion that was had, at least in that field. And I embrace that wholly, that there is no sense that you need to be faithful, except for those bits and pieces or the spirit that you wish to have fidelity to. So elision is the idea you can get rid of 99% of the source in your adaptation, and that's perfectly fine, and that's actually what I've had to do and enjoyed doing. Interpolation is when you move things around, you change them about. You may expand upon things, make a minor part, a major part, or vice versa. And invention, I think, is self-explanatory. You add new elements that were nowhere near present in the source. They are your own, and you wish to add them. And I think talking through the examples, it'll make sense. So those are the three tools, I think, that are the most important, especially if you're thinking about adapting to things that you see quite divergent, but for some reason you want to put together. Features of games could take endless numbers of slides, and these are just a few of the points that I wanted to focus on. The rules in my mind include anything that define the play. The ideas, the materials, the setup, the space, the setting, the time. Time is very important to me, as I said before, so I'll talk about that as we go. What players can and cannot do. And that point for me really resonates as a teacher of students who are often expecting to come into a room, even a class that is based on teaching metafiction, interaction fiction, role-playing games. Some of my students know that we'll play Dungeons and Dragons in one of my classes before they leave the class. They don't quite understand that means they're going to be doing things from day one. And then also the rules are what the game does. That go beyond what the players do, in particular, whatever those automated systems are. The second central column, choice and chance. For me, choice is really the concept I've enjoyed exploring the most in combining literature and film and games. What players can choose to do and how they have meaningful effects relates a lot, in my mind, as I approach my students to the learning situation. To the situation of me as a teacher, how can I set up my students to have choices that I don't take away with the threat of a bad grade, for example. The risks that they can take. And if you're willing to take risks, that means you have a whole set of choices. As long as you're living in a world or a college class where those choices can have an effect that's meaningful to you. Also, what the game does that takes away that choice, or at least constrains that choice, so it's not just completely a matter of choice, but you have to work within certain contexts and be sensitive to those. And very important, I think, to any enjoyable game in the long term is that there are specific ways that you can choose to interact with your fellow players, and the game system also interacts with those players. The third column is just what the goals are. This one I have trouble with, I have to admit. I like the goal to be to learn, because in some ways that's my job. But also, I know some learners, some players, some people really enjoy games that are competitive. I really enjoy games that are cooperative. I think if there's a mix between the two, you get to hit as many possible play styles and learning styles as possible. So what players must do to win, of course, and then what else players might achieve along the way, which can be interesting. That may or may not have to do with winning. And then I have these little yellow boxes I put in things that I'm concerned about mostly as an instructor, which are all part of the designs that I've done with these 3 games that I'm going to get to in a moment. So what is the thing I want you to learn through this experience? Oftentimes for me it is having the experience of play or experiencing an interactive piece of fiction or an interactive performance or a dynamic that we can achieve in real time that they may not have ever had before, because then we'll have prior and later activities where they may be doing a conventional college paper or a research project or some other work that they're going to give me, and they will then be speaking from an experience, at least that experience, if they had had no others in the past. So they become, they may not become experts, but they have a sense of what it is like to be in the shoes of a player, if that's not part of their culture. So I have 3 examples I'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation. The first is a game I call Aftermath, based on a film called After the Dark. Originally the film was called The Philosophers, but I think the producers decided nobody was going to go see that movie. The second is Into the Labyrinth, based on the David Bowie film Labyrinth. And you'll see there's a little insignia to the right of his head. That's the symbol for D&D 5th edition. So there's a little bit of D&D in there as well. And then the last is a game I'm working on right now. I recently completed a certificate from Central Michigan University in applied game design. It's a really fun experience. And I started working on a game that is about adapting a film from a novel, or making your own film based on a novel. I chose Dracula because even though Sherlock Holmes is the most adapted fictional character to screen, I thought Dracula was a better fit for me. It's in the top 10. And you'll see there's the original Dracula film, there's the Coppola adaptation, which is truer to the source, and then there's this little game that came out called Dracula by Cosmos. It's been a couple decades now, and I'll talk about those, why I chose those. These are all the inspirations for these games that I play with my students. So Aftermath is based, as I said, on After the Dark. John Huddle's directed in 2013, it came out. And the premise of the film is that we have a college professor working in Jakarta. He has 21 students who I think are the children of diplomats. So they're fairly stressed out, fairly elite. And he plays philosophy games with them. And in the film, it's the last day of class. There's elements of the film that I definitely allied. I totally keep off the table. The professor is having an affair with one of his students, which is a terrible stereotype usually of the English professor. But in this case, it's a philosophy professor. And he does ask them this provocative question. Imagine that there is a nuclear apocalypse and there is a bunker that can fit 10 of you. There's 21 students. Who 10 of you are worthy of being saved? And I say worthy because there are judgments he's inviting the students to make of each other. Now again, in the film, this is the last day of class, so there's established relationships. There's a subtext of this sort of illicit affair going on, and there's a lot of other tension below the surface. I'm not interested in any of that. It makes the film go, but we're doing something else with this game. Also in the film, he makes this terrible decision to play the game with them. So he's one of the people, of the 22, who may take a spot in the bunker. In the drama, the students accept the premise and work with it. Along the way, they come to resist it, and then eventually some of them outright reject it because they realize that their professor of ethics is acting quite unethically, and some of them know more information than others. So there's a varying level of knowledge about what the true situation is. So that's the film. So I'm using my tools of adaptation on the film, and I'm going to get rid of at least 95% of all of that. The story, the characters, relations, setting, plot, social context, and the unsavory elements. In the film, they go through this process 3 times. And that, I think, helps illustrate one of the game theory principles common to the problem of the Spanish prisoner, for example. That if you repeat a game over and over again, you realize eventually it doesn't do anyone any good if you snitch on someone else. So the iterative process in the film makes a dramatic point that fuels. I don't have time. I have 50 minutes, and I do play this game in 50 minutes. I also get rid of all the ethical rebellion that the students commit. I've just met these students, and I'm not going to try to invite them to rebel. In the 49 minutes they have to get to know me, 1 minute isn't enough for a rebellion. We do that later. So I get rid of almost everything except the what-if premise, and I strip it down to that. For changing the dynamics, this has to do with changing what I think will be the dynamics of students. I imagine many of my students coming directly from high school to college, and most of my students in this class are either going to be first semester honors students, first semester gen ed students, or last semester or second to last semester English majors. And among all of those, I expect most of them will not have a class like the one they're about to take with me. So I want them to all participate, and I do that by giving them a choice, and I force them to make a choice. By being in the class, everyone makes a choice, and it's an easy choice to make. All you have to do is pick a name. You have to pick one of the roles on the board who will be saved. And I want them to be able to revise those choices. So one person saving one person doesn't mean that that is the final say, that there's going to be some push and pull dynamic among the people in the room. And this gets me to learn a lot about my students, who are mostly new people to me, strangers to me. And then there are also hidden pieces of information, which is part of the movie. There's pieces of information you learn about that fictional role, that identity, the persona that you've taken on. You find out some other information, not just this is my job, but also I'm sick, or this is my job, and also I know 7 languages that I can speak fluently. So there's another piece of information to complicate the game. And lastly, the invention, as I mentioned, this is a classroom activity for the first day of class. And I think that really works well to show my students that the interactivity that we're going to be studying is also something we're going to be implementing and changing in how we relate to each other. And that's, again, based on assumptions that people who may have had that experience educationally in the past are willing to do it again, and those who haven't had it, they need it. I want to give that to them, and I want them to know that on day one, if it's not to their liking. And then lastly, for choices, that's a lot to do, and it can be challenging for people, especially those who are more introverted or who have other issues. So I do a lot of scaffolding and a lot of formal structuring of how we're going to interact with each other, and I control how much time we spend on all these things, because time is always the enemy in some ways of having longer conversations. This isn't intended to inspire the long conversation across the 15-week semester, but we got to get that started in 50 minutes. So the game. I'm going to show you the next slide. It will visualize some of this, but bear with me. Each player chooses a role, and I put the number of roles equal to the number of students or the players in the room. And they get an envelope that has the role, like I put English professor among the envelopes. They never make it into the bunker. But they have a choice, and each person who comes up to the table sees 2 choices. So they don't have to read all 25. And most of my classes, I've done this, and I've done this like 4 or 5 times. It's usually between 20 and 25 students. So it's a great size. I love when I can teach that many. The first 10 players, once everyone's got their envelopes, everyone has a role. The first 10 players, and it's just the people sitting in the front of the room, I say, okay, tell me who to save. And then we circle it on the board. I'll jump ahead. So this is the first 8 people who get saved. Stay-at-home mom is the only gendered role, potentially gendered role. She always gets saved. And there's various reasons for that. You can imagine reproduction, other people's feelings. But I'm going to go back to the previous slide. The 11th player has to choose if they want to save someone else to then remove someone from the selections. And they get to do both of those in one action. They have one choice swap out one person and add in a different person. Everyone gets to do that until we then finally have everyone having had a turn. And then, after that, I open up discussion. If you look under goals, one of the goals is that they debate and vote. So the second round is that everyone has an open discussion, and anyone who feels like they know there's a role that needs to be saved and they're willing to name the one that is not saved, that's ejected, they make a proposal. I propose we keep the English professor and eject the kindergarten teacher, right? It's usually the opposite. It's always the opposite. And then we have a really quick discussion. We debate it informally. I don't have formal debate instruction. And then we have a vote, majority vote. Okay? And I break the tie if there's a tie. We do that a few times, and then we have our final 10 people, roles who are saved. The people who have those envelopes open them up, and they tell the viewer, the audience, what the secondary trait is, and also the life expectancy. Those are the two pieces I put in. So in terms of choice and chance, I give each individual a choice. That choice is contingent on not being unmade or remade by someone else. And also, those secret traits may be positive or negative in terms of how valuable this fictive person is based only on their job, and now on these other two characteristics, how long they're going to live, and what other things they bring to the table, which may be good or bad for the community or for themselves. In the goals of the game, one clear goal is you cannot save yourself. You can't vote for yourself. If you're holding that role, you can't put yourself in the bunker. We don't want everyone just to vote for themselves, and then it's just a matter of who goes first and who goes last, and then whoever's more argumentative. All of these things are good for me as an instructor because I get to learn what the potential dynamics are for the semester. I want them to be able to make and revise choices together, and I want them to be able to follow some sort of structure of cooperating and making decisions together. This is a terrible situation I'm throwing at them. So I think in the future, and this is something I'm learning about in the past few years, having an open door policy, maybe using an X card or some other dynamic, because when I was growing up, the prospect of nuclear apocalypse seemed imminent. And I grew up in Chicago, and I was taught to hide under my desk. We had nuclear assault drills in addition to fire drills. My students don't identify with that particular situation, but there's certainly other situations that they might find traumatic, like school shootings. And then in terms of teaching and learning, this activity, I think, gets them out of their comfort zone. And if it's comfortable enough that they come back to the class, it allows them to see what kind of dynamics we're going to have in our activities and our discussions. We do have time either at the end of the session or the next session to talk about what are the logics or illogical parts of the exercise, what are the ethics or unethical aspects of this situation that you're in, and what are the limitations otherwise of the game. What can and can we not do through this more playful version of a philosophical premise. We don't watch the film in this class, but I do always let them know what my work is based on in case they wanted to get sort of the fuller picture. Okay, so again, this is the snapshot of the game. These roles are ones that have been saved in the past. I had carpenter on because I really think a carpenter would be a good role, but carpenter never gets picked. I had plumber on in the past, sometimes gets picked. Accountant and politician never get picked. Kindergarten teacher almost always makes it. I have artist, musician, and writer. And part of this is I'm speaking to a group of students who are figuring out what they're going to do. So I'm also trying to think about what are the potential careers of the people in the room. And this is not a perfect picture, but it is based on some of that sensibility. Engineer and doctor almost always get picked. Yeah, the ones that are circled are the ones that almost always get picked. So yeah, as I said, we have the individual selection, we have the group discussion of last minute changes, and then we find out the secrets. It's probably too small to see, but this is my favorite secret because it's quite positive. And I put it in the English professor envelope just to have a joke. But the trait reads, "You are exceptionally, truly kind, a trait so sincere that no one could deny it." Generally a good trait if you're having 10 strangers live in a bunker for an indefinite amount of time under conditions of high stress. Other traits, some of which I got from the movie, are you recently were in touch or in contact with a patient who had Ebola virus, and you now endangered the people in the bunker. I'm not going to say any more, but there's some sort of insidious traits that the professor gives too, if you want to watch the film. But I don't like to do any of those gotchas, that really turn things in sort of a maniacal or a coercive way. So that's Aftermath. And the Aftermath title comes from the idea of there's consequences to these decisions. Even when you think you have enough information to make your decisions, then you find out other things. So we're also talking about the game theory idea of incomplete information and how that changes the nature of the game, so to speak. And as I said, I've used this in about 5 or 6 classes so far. Okay, Into the Labyrinth. This is a game I developed a few years after Aftermath, based on the David Bowie film. Well, Jim Henson was the director in 1986. The plot is generally a teen girl gives her little brother to the Goblin King. She's sick of him. Her half-brother, he's a baby though. So the Goblin King comes her way and swoops him away. And then she figures out she made a big mistake. So she goes on a quest, she makes some fantastical friends, and she learns her lesson, and it's a happy ending. I use some of the rules from Dungeons and Dragons, basically the adventure that you go on, and some of the things that you're typically going to do in a D&D campaign. But again, I'm not going to do it in campaign length, which could be weeks or months or years or decades for some, but I'm going to do it in a 50-minute session along with some classes before and after. So the session 0 to prepare people. The week before, we have 3 class sessions to talk about D&D. They read parts of the rules. I don't have them watch the movie because I want it to be a surprise. And sometimes I use some of the video from the movie in the session. And then after, at least 1 or 2 days after, we have a debriefing and we talk about the experience. So again, I get rid of most of it. I get rid of most of the movie and characters and plot, at least 90%. I get rid of 99% of the rules because I really just want to accomplish something that's an interesting experience in that time frame. This is not a class where I'm teaching my students how to analyze the rules of the role-playing game and give me a critique of them. I'm teaching them what it's like to have the experience that might resemble something that's fun, that they might want to do again. And I'm trying to capture that by limiting all the other things that I may find fun, but don't make sense within our constrained time. And also the purpose of the class, where we have a unit on metafiction, we have a unit on interactive fiction, and then we have this unit on role-playing games. And I see connections across all of those. And I want them to have something about role-playing games that's unique to that form versus the other two. And for me, the live play experience, or at least playing live, whether you're in person or not, is one of those elements I really want to focus on. So the week that we play D&D, and students love this because they have a lot of midterms coming up during this time, they sign up for one of the sessions, and then the other 2 days they have off. So they have time to think about other things or do other work. So I throw all that stuff into that funnel, that beautiful funnel on the bottom left. And we just focus on having a fantasy quest that's imminent. Something happens. So instead of having the character or group of characters give away a child, I have a town invaded by a set of monsters like goblins, and they come and take the children out of a village. So it's something that they have to respond to if they have any sense of heroism, and some of my students do not. They want to stay at the inn and get drunk. And they can do that too, but I'm pretty much throwing them on the railroad of, we're going to accomplish this quest. So most of them are usually persuaded, not all the time. So I have a 3-act structure. It's not a conventional 3-act structure. It's just 3 different pieces of a typical D&D game. There's a combat where you have the goblins or other creatures invade, and you have to fight them off, but of course they get away. Second is you have to solve a riddle to get through the labyrinth, or some other challenge to get through the labyrinth. And that's the shortest element because we need time for the combat. And then the boss fight at the end, where you come across the Goblin King in his palace, and there's hundreds of monsters around him, so you can't use combat again. You have to do something else. So this third stage involves the players, usually 6 max players, talking to each other, and I give them time to talk. They've had the 2 parts. We have 15 or 20 minutes left in class. They say, okay, now you're going to make a plan. Everyone has to agree on the plan. You have to come to consensus, and everyone has to have a role to play in the plan. So as they go along, they have to do things in 3 different ways within that time we have in class. I give them simplified characters with fewer choices just so we can get the characters done and created, and we usually do that the week prior. And I also streamline combat and task resolution. I'll talk about that more. Just so we can have something that resembles what they could experience if they played D&D in the past or some other game in the past or will in the future. So they're having an authentic experience, but it's a minimal or a minimized version of it. For invention, I give them each a 20-sided die. Some of them have never seen these before. It's not as nice as the fancy one at the bottom there, but I give them each a die so they have something to take away from it and explain that we're going to be using this as sort of a random number generator. I encourage them to make up character names and backstories. I once had a student who named his character Chobani because he worked at Wegmans, and that became like the talking point for that adventure for some time after. Relationships among player characters, I give them a few minutes to decide if they know each other as characters. This is also a fun narrative moment that makes the game for some of the students. And they have to collaborate on that plan, as I mentioned. Lastly, I give out a signed autograph from David Bowie as the Goblin King at the end to the MVP. And the 6 players decide who the MVP is, because it's not my decision to make. And I try to bring backups because a lot of times they all want their MVP award. So I bring some extra copies. So features of the game. I give them a list of choices of typical fantasy characters by species and class and some personal attributes. Like I said, we have a preset 3-act scenario. They don't have the full range of freedom that you can have in a more free-form setting. Just so we can get it through. And so I am railroading them, that old standby, that I'm giving them the plot and I'm asking them to come along with me. And I say that to them, that this is one version of play to get something done within our limited time. But I give a lot of guidance. I do a lot of guiding to help them make their own decisions, but I give them a narrower set of decisions. And I think that works in some versions of interactive fiction too, that you have a vocabulary and set of contexts and choices. Like for one, the D&D part that I keep, aside from the fantasy setting and the quest, is if they roll their 20-sided die and they want to do something difficult, if they're skilled at it, they succeed at 10 or higher. If they're not skilled at it, they succeed at 15 or higher, which gives them pretty good odds if they're working together and everyone's trying different things. As I said, characters choose the personal attributes, so the narrative is under their control. Some students write out whole paragraphs of backstory so they can verbally share that with the group before we go on our quest. The actions they take are usually based on genre conventions and the limitations of our scenario. Some people choose to be self-interested and do other things than join the quest. And I think it becomes apparent to them if they don't get on the railroad tracks with us, we're going to leave them behind. The train will leave the station. So a lot of times they'll go along. But that's also good because it allows me to demonstrate another aspect of tabletop role-playing, of how personal choice versus character choice interact, and how narrative in some ways compels some kinds of choices over others, or at least based on conventionality. Players are encouraged to collaborate more as they go with the challenge and with the final boss monster. They have to talk more as they go along. Combat becomes less important. And of course the dice add a random element. the goals are fairly humble, just to go through the scenario. Survive the combat. Most people have. I think one person didn't. You can get hit like 4 times before you die. And then someone can save you if they want to. And sometimes your fellow students don't want to save you, especially if they know you already. Solve a riddle or a challenge. I have a whole series of challenges to give students. And I usually just try to pick one. There's a riddle in the movie, for example, that I use sometimes. But riddles don't usually work too well in play. And then they have to coordinate that plan. And then for my goals for doing this game is that they reflect on it. And we have this as a matter of discussion, comparing and contrasting with what we've done before. And then what are the units to come on experimental novels and films and poetry. And I always want my students to be able to talk about what are the potentials of this form, what are the limitations of the form, and how this relates both critically, historically, but also ludically. What are the different kinds of play that are possible? Yeah, so this is just some of the images. This is the classic characters from D&D 3rd edition at a table with a map as if they're role-playing. So I really like that image, a sort of meta level. And then this is a fan art that depicts the moment when the character in Labyrinth is being asked the riddle to pass through the doorway. This is an old riddle. It precedes the film. I saw it in an episode of Doctor Who from the 1970s, I think, Tom Baker. I can tell you what it is later. And then that David Bowie autographed, signed autograph is that it's the MVP award for the boss fight. I had, long before Jumanji came out, I had students do a dance fight with the Goblin King, and it was fantastic. Okay, my last game is one I haven't taught yet because I'm developing it, as I said, based on this program that I participated in. It's called Adaptation. And the idea is that I have my students assume the roles of filmmakers, different roles related to producing a film that is based on a novel. I chose Dracula because I feel like the cast of characters and what it does as a text makes sense to me. Potentially Adaptation would be something that we could do with any text. I'm not there yet. So these are just the different prior media that I would ask my students to interact with, so they would actually watch the films, read the novel, even play the game, and then we would go through and have the actual game of being these fictive filmmakers. The process could end, as I see it, with them making either a trailer or a 10-minute version of their film. Buffalo State has a television and film arts program and a communication department which has film production. So I often have students who are on the production side of the field. So for adapting Dracula as the text that would become the subject of this process, I'd get rid of at least 50% of the material and ask my students to pick half the characters, sort of like in the other game. Pick half the characters to save, to keep within your text, or fewer. The game from Cosmos only has Van Helsing and Dracula fighting it out in London. Dracula is trying to go house to house and claim victims, and Van Helsing is trying to go house to house and find the coffins. It's a very simple version of the dynamics, nothing else. So basically, I want them to make a horror film where there's a good versus evil morality, which might be redundant, and a two-sided hunt. And that's one of my favorite features of the novel, is that Van Helsing, but even more so Mina Harker as the figure of the new woman, is enabling this access to Dracula's psyche, and they're able to track him as he is hunting them. So having that as part of the element of their film. Now, for interpolation, I would ask my students to update the narrative to be a different setting, so it's not 19th century England. Adapt the nature of human technology and society, because the way I read the novel Dracula, it's a commentary on the changes in communication technology specifically. The different specialists in the book, including Mina and Jonathan and Dr. Seward and even Quincy the cowboy, they all have specialized access to different ways of communicating with each other, which help bring about the demise of Dracula, including just a simple thing of being able to share telegrams with each other, to communicate over long distances. And I think communication enables knowledge, and fighting sort of the threats of whatever Dracula is from the past. So I'd ask them to think about that with technology and society, and that relates, of course, to film adaptation and changing different media, how rapidly they change. And I'd also want them to make Dracula new. Every Dracula adaptation gives Dracula something new, or something is removed. Some truth we know about Dracula. We even have vampires now who can walk around in the daylight, and they're shiny. So I'd want them to think about the narrative text to make that new for themselves, but also in terms of invention. There's lots of invention. This is a multi-step process, and I imagine this game would take 15 weeks, the whole semester. I'd want them to add things to the narrative that aren't present. I'd want them to add effects that they could imagine, whether they make the film or not. So the visual, sound, motion, casting, shooting sites, the things that make cinema what cinema is, at least in a pre-streaming media sense. Choices that you cannot make with a novel, or at least for most novels, not typically associated with them. I also have this idea, and this is where I finally figured out how to make this more of a game that's not just about cooperation or like an extended group project. Each student would make investments that they would record and give to me. And these would be their personal investments in the choices that they've made up to that point in the semester, where they have specific narrative elements they want to make to the end of the production, and they have specific cinematic choices that they want to make to the end of the production, including casting choices. And if those elements make it to the end, then they would get some sort of payoff, some sort of bonus. What this will do then is influence their future choices. So they will want to champion certain choices they've made to not be unmade. So it adds an element of tension that the other students won't know what their choices are. By the end of it, I'm going to have the students take on different production roles, try to influence each other, and maybe sabotage each other. Because if you have certain investments, you know that your classmates do as well. So it is a mixture of cooperation and competition. And if they can, make a premiere feature, a short one. So the way the game works is I have these 5 stages. We pick the narrative elements based on our readings and viewings of the films. They choose cinematic effects. They take on the different roles, which would include writer. I'm not sure if the writer ever is truly involved in film production, but that's a potential role. Screenwriter, director, the star, and film editor, and a producer. And the teams would then have a combination of those roles. We'll have a stage 4 where they have to pitch their product to the producers in an almost finished stage, and the producers are going to be made up of members of the other teams in the class. So they'll have one member from each of the other teams become the crew of producers who have to say yes or no, and they can veto different elements. And then lastly, they have a premiere where the whole class watches whatever they've able to do, either storyboards or a trailer or a short film. And then they will have audience feedback forms. So they'll have simulation of a lot of the different stages in a very short time. So they have choices of picking their elements and effects. They have roles that allow them to have more say over some choices or other a few weeks into the semester, once we've had some choices made. They'll have roles, their powers of their role will influence what other people can do. And then they'll have those hidden investments, which will set some of their personal win conditions. So the goals are, I've mentioned already, I think. You want your adaptation to be successful, invested in lots of choices. You want your personal investments to make it to the end. And you can be successful also by working against, interacting in sort of a negative way against your own teammates or against the other teams by trying to halt some of their elements. I didn't have a lot of space at the end, but there's all sorts of work we're doing here in terms of learning. One of the elements I want is to compare the value of the text that we're reading in sort of a conventional English major lit crit framework and the value that we get from it by going through this whole process of the production and all the choices we've made. How the students in particular are different. Not the text, but the student's relationship to the textuality is different after going through all of these different attitudes and choices. So these are some rough pictures of the first two stages. The first is just a list of different narrative elements. I have 4 columns: characters, settings, plot points, and themes and motifs. And so there's all sorts of content that comes from Stoker's novel, and we would do lists like this for each of the pieces, the films, and potentially the game. And then on the right-hand side, I have some potential cinematic mappings that makes it different. The casting choice of Brad Pitt is in the upper left there in the red. He's played a vampire before, so I think he's the perfect role, perfect actor for that role. We'll set it in Buffalo, New York, of course, because that's easy for me. And then one of the things that happens in the lower left here is that Dracula loses his job. And the theme, sort of the generic theme at the bottom right, is Americana. So we're going to have a film that makes a statement about the state of American society and culture. So it's not just about Brad Pitt, it's about the everyman vampire in Buffalo, in the Rust Belt. Okay, so that's as far as I've gotten on my screenplay. But if you have ideas, let me know. That's as far as I've mapped out the game so far, but I'm imagining I'll be working on stages 3, 4, and 5 into the future. My conclusions, quickly. Anything can be a game, I think, if it meets these criteria. I'm sure these will change soon after I give you this talk. Players have to be able to do something. There's going to be limits of what they can do, of course, but they have to do some things, and it has to be clear. Choices and chance both have to have impact. I think, oftentimes games are categorized into games of skill and games of chance. I think skill is something we're working on in the class already. But I'm focusing on choice and chance because I want the dynamics of those choices and chances to be present in their minds. And I think that helps them develop some skills to think about that. The players in the game have to interact with each other. And the one I have the hardest with actually is this last one, that goals motivate play. Not just goals of learning, which is something I'm really concerned about, but that there's a sense of winning. Adding that winning element is the one that I stick on and I think about the most. But I do think that helps to give structure. It forces me to make choices myself. And I think play and learning can align because you make tasks more playful, and I adapt my lesson plans, really, are the things being made into games. And I think if I do that in the real time of the class, that may encourage my students to be risk takers. And I think there's a lot of reasons in education my students become risk averse. And I would hate to teach the kind of content that I'm trying to teach, literature, cinema, games, ideas related to ludicism, and then leave behind my students' hearts when we're just sort of, it's an intellectual exercise. I want them to come along as fully as possible. This is a quote from Linda Hutchins' book, A Theory of Adaptation. There aren't a lot of great books on adaptation, but most of the ones I found were on film adaptation. And I think that's going to change. I think more people are talking about adaptation across multiple forms. I like Hutchins' book, though, and here's the quote. Part of this pleasure, I want to argue, comes simply from repetition with variation, from the comfort of ritual combined with the piquancy of surprise. Recognition and remembrance are part of the pleasure and risk of experiencing an adaptation. So too is change. I think that speaks for itself, but we can talk about that, of course. This is a list of my sources, including the Hutchins book, the full citation. Mainly it's a list of the different sources that went into inspiring these games. I did cite myself because I wanted to let you know that Into the Labyrinth is coming out in a book of micro RPGs to be used in the classroom from Carnegie Mellon and ETC Press, hopefully this year. And this is me when I was with ZZ Top, as some of my students like to remind me. And this is my contact information. I have a work website. I also have a website on RPG Geek for the few amateur games I've released. And since today is Free RPG Day, I just wanted to give a little announcement there that you should go all out and play some games today. if you get a chance. There's some great game stores in Rochester, for example. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes. Absolutely. I think if, for example, if I had a student who told me they wanted to make the most faithful rendition of a particular novel, I would tell them to go for it, and I'd fully support that. What I don't want is a single-minded adherence to fidelity as the one true way. So anything that is anything other than the one true way, I would fully support. And I do think that if you use that word spirit, you get a lot of freedom. And that freedom also includes adhering to the elements that are faithful that you believe in, or whatever, any individual. So absolutely, I think spirit is a good concept to hold together, so you don't say, well, I have to do everything that's not faithful. That would be ridiculous too. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Right, the question is, am I concerned about the group dynamics, specifically in the game Adaptus, because the game may reward certain dynamics and penalize other dynamics? Yes, yes, I'm worried about that, and for most of my games, they're much shorter, and this is more ambitious, so I imagine, like many of you in your professional lives, I'd be doing playtesting. It's a weird game to play test if it's a semester long, and it involves being students in a college class and reading Dracula and watching these films. So I'd have to find a way to minimize the impact of that, potentially by teaching one of the 5 units and not putting my students on a railroad track for 15 weeks without testing each piece separately. So yeah, I think my own learning curve will go up as I actually put the wheel to the road or the tires to the pavement. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh yes, in the back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, so I think you're speaking particular about Adaptus, the last game? Yeah, okay. So the question is, how do I sort of frame the process? So how am I assessing students because they're doing work beyond just the in-class activities or the pieces I've identified here? I have students do pre-tests and post-tests. I have them do self-reflections. I can have students do assessments of like group presentations, like students who are not in the group will assess another group. I almost never have students assess individual other students because I don't find that useful. But I'm a firm believer in self-reflection and guided self-reflection, so I'm actually teaching them how to think about their work. I'm a fan of Donald Schoen's reflection and practice theory. It's difficult to do. But I do try to expose them to, a life cycle of their thought process. So before, during, and after, and a lot of times it's after, that our discussions will continue either as a class or as me talking to them. They may be journaling. These are sort of formative exercises that lead to more summative, bigger projects. They might be, again, research papers, critical papers. Oftentimes the group-based games are related then to individual assignments where the grade is weighted more heavily. So I'm encouraging risk-taking and less grading in those game-based activities, but I haven't completely strayed away from grading in the other activities. And I think for some students, I'd really lose them if I didn't grade, and that's a larger battle I haven't really resolved yet. Yeah, but I absolutely feel like there's things that have to happen before, during, and after, so it's not just sort of what they call the one shot, and then we don't talk about it ever or think about it again. I try to encourage them to have a longer mind frame. Yeah, thank you. Yes? Right, so the question is, how do I deal with students who may have pre-existing notions of what D&D is? I imagine that could include positive and negative. And I do have students who are D&D players, have been playing for years, and I have students who have never played, and I have students who are not interested in playing that much. When you come to my session with the 6 students, I invite everyone to sit and observe if they don't want to participate. And I tell them that they truly can leave if they need to. And by that time, it's like the 5th or 6th week in the semester, and they know what kind of teacher I am. And I am always asking them to trust me on that. I tell them that also before they show up, so they don't have to be in the room and then say no to me in person. In terms of D&D, we do talk about in other days D&D's sort of painful transformation, sort of the limitations of the form. Some of them inherited from fantasy, others just sort of from society. So we do have larger cultural conversations. There's not really time for that in the game sessions, but those are surrounding discussions where I try to encourage students to be able to speak critically about D&D as a thing, not just the game, but also meaningful in a social or cultural context. Yeah, thank you. Yes, in the back. Right. So what are my thoughts on the concepts of adaptation and influence? Well, in literary studies, I think Harold Bloom is the great purveyor of the idea of the anxiety of influence. I typically don't teach Bloom in this class because I'm teaching more of the Ludic and game studies centered concepts as they relate to adaptation. But I do think one of the arguments I'm making, sometimes more implicitly than necessary, is that there is a historical progression and I think a cultural evolution that goes from metafiction, not very popular nowadays, to my chagrin, but that's okay, interactive fiction and role-playing games that across the decades from like the 1940s to the 1980s, all 3 of those sort of co-evolved or contributed to each other's existence and evolution in the world. So no, I actually haven't thought about using influence, but I probably will now. And I'll have to think about it more before I can say anything smart about it. But thank you for that. Other questions? Yeah, thanks, everyone.
That's our last talk for today. I just want to remind people, it was posted on the Discord, but in case you didn't see, the museum closes at 8 today, so feel free to look around and explore. And tomorrow it closes at 5, so you won't be able to after the conference ends tomorrow. So feel free to enjoy it later today or tomorrow, but that'll be it for the museum time.